Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and we are broadcasting on Yagra and Turrbal country. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the future of work and different economic possibilities. I spoke to John Quiggin, who is a local economist, very renowned economist, and initially I said we were going to talk about the universal basic income with John, but then we covered all kinds of things about reducing working hours and job guarantees and all kinds of different things. And so it was a great chat. It's always great having a chat with John, actually. And so most of the show we'll be hearing from him. I also spoke to Stephen Hale, who is an economist based in Adelaide. His specialty field is modern monetary theory, which is a sort of complex thing that we won't go into too much. But we spoke about his idea for a job guarantee and his sort of critiques of some models of the universal basic income. So we'll play that as well. And I think in all of this, one of the things we should talk about, there's a lot of talk at the moment about productivity, and there's also, of course, talk about the future of employment with gains made in generative AI and things like that. And so there is, at the moment, some conversations happening around the future of work. But one of the things that we should really be talking about is what kind of work most enables us to flourish as individuals and a society. And part of that as well is, work that is tied to a profit motive in the industry or a workplace that's trying to make money ultimately will serve the purposes of money and not necessarily of the workers in that business or our society as a whole. And so trying to enable people to do the kind of work that they do out of purely a passion or a love or their own visions of how society could be better, I think will bring out the best of people, of our own creativity and talents, as well as meet the needs that aren't necessarily the needs of our capitalist system and its demand to keep on growing. So we should be encouraging that amount of work. And ZZZ actually is a great example, which has been going for 50 years this year as we're celebrating. And it's that whole time it's been done mostly by volunteers. And it wouldn't have been able to happen if people didn't have the time to make that happen. But also, a lot of the amazing things about ZZZ would never have happened if it was run on a commercial basis. And so trying to create these spaces where people can do the work that they really care about and really love is going to be really vital for us as a society. And I think it makes us all better people. It allows the full use of our skills, and it'll make us happier as well if we're not always stuck in the grind for the monetary gain, not necessarily ours, often the monetary gain of our employers. So anyway, it should be a set understanding of what kind of work we should be looking at in the future. That's what I reckon anyway. And John agrees with me, I think. And so let's get into my chat with John Quiggin.
My name is John Quiggin. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Queensland.
And one thing that you have written and talked a lot about over the years is the idea of a universal basic income, and that's what we're going to be chatting about today. Can you first give us a brief overview of what is a universal basic income?
Well, the core principle is that everyone should have the opportunity to have enough to live on decently. Now, there are a couple of different versions of how that might be implemented. One is essentially to give everybody in the community, no matter how well off, enough money to live on, and then try and recover that cost through tax. The other, which is my preference, is to work with the existing social welfare system, raise benefits to a livable level, and expand the eligibility in such a way that everybody is capable of accessing it.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a bit more about the models later, because I think, that is important to figure out a model of how it might work. But I guess before we get to that, let's talk more generally about why do you think that something like this is important?
Well, I think essentially it's important just for the reasons I said, that everyone should have the chance to live decently, that we shouldn't be condemning anybody to poverty, and that we're wealthy enough as a community to achieve that.
Yeah, I thought there's something as well, like that there's a kind of avoiding the negative of not having people, starving or homeless or in poverty, but there's a kind of positive idea of, like, if everybody has enough to get by, then we allow a bit more flourishing, people have a bit more time and creativity to really progress society as well. I think, is that something that we should talk about as part of this idea?
It certainly is. I mean, it implies, I guess, and this goes together with issues around employment policy, that on the one hand, we should be aiming to ensure that everybody who is capable of working in a paid job and wants to can get one, and at the same time that people can nonetheless manage a living while making a contribution to the community in different ways, and of course the people who through old age, illness and so forth can't work also have a decent standard of living. So certainly the idea of extending the notion of work to include creative contributions to society, I think, is an important part of the whole idea.
Yeah, there is as well as like a financial barrier to bringing this in that it would cost a lot of money. There is an ideological barrier as well about, like, I don't know, the lifters and leaners, or like people needing to work hard or something like that. That also sort of would need to be challenged, wouldn't it?
Certainly, the kind of versions that's a Joe Hockey phrase, I think. The kind of versions that says that implied implicit in that is people on high incomes are making more of a contribution, which doesn't necessarily actually reflect the social contribution people make. But secondly, a very narrow notion of lifting that only applies to paid market work.
Yeah, for sure. As well as, I guess rich people have the ability to make lots of money through passive income, through investing money. They're not, once you're rich, you don't have to work hard anymore, hey?
But that's certainly true, and very much, I mean, one kind of problematic part of the inheritance left, of course, is a focus on the rich as non-workers, and therefore on working as, in essence, what validates people. That's something which has its value, but we need to have a broader notion of work than that older tradition of workerism would suggest.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analysis, I guess, and I suppose it reflects in some ways the needs in our society, where at this point in industrial capitalism we can generate our physical needs quite cheaply, and we don't have this big industrial workforce to make the things we need to use. But there's so much care work that's not being done, it's underfunded, and social connections and things like that. That's really where we need to be investing our energy.
Yes, and some of that, of course, is paid market work, but also we should be expanding the notion of the kinds of voluntary care in families or otherwise that would be eligible for support under a universal basic income or livable income guarantee. So people ought to be able to ought to be able to get enough to live on while doing things like volunteering for Meals on Wheels. I think it has a newer, cooler name now, but those kinds of activities which a lot of people undertake, we ought to be able to make a living just doing those things.
You are an economist, and obviously there's always a bit of social science in any economics or anything, but let's talk a bit about numbers and models. So you spoke at the start about there's a couple of different models. Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. Well, in a theoretical sense, in a society that just had only individuals, all these models would be roughly the same. That is, you can either give everybody the money and then tax it back, or you can expand means-tested benefits. The big difference between the two arises from the fact that that people live in families, and that the way our welfare system works, typically benefits go to families, whereas taxes are paid primarily by individuals. And so what that turns out to mean is that you need much higher rates of taxation to fund the universal payout model than you need in terms of the combined effect of tax rates and benefit withdrawal in a benefit-based model, and that's why I favour the second model. So it's actually much more manageable in terms of the fiscal policy aspects to start with our existing benefit system and expand that, rather than just scrap it and replace it with a universal payment to everybody.
Yeah, you're probably familiar with the work of Stephen Hale, who does a lot on modern monetary theory, and I will be playing an interview with him where he suggests a job guarantee as a third kind of model of this.
Sure. As I mentioned, a commitment to full employment, in the sense that everyone who wants a job can get one, is an important complement to a livable income guarantee. That is, as people without enough wealth to live on the proceeds of wealth, the ideal position for workers is to be able to get a job if you need one, but also to be able to survive without a job, so that your employer doesn't have the power over you that they have in a typical labour market, particularly one where there's substantial unemployment. It's one thing that has changed since we last spoke is that we've had a long period of something approaching full employment, the kind of thing that prevailed back in the 1960s, when essentially, if you didn't like your current job, you could quit and find a new one. We're getting back a bit closer to that situation, and that's a big increase in the welfare of working people.
Yeah. I guess one question, and you've talked a bit about it, but I guess the question that always comes up is, like, how would something like this be paid for, considering our as it currently is, all our tax money is spent on other things. There's not like this pool of money that can just be given away. So do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. So you need a substantial increase in taxation. Of course, we have seen both big reductions in tax rates for high-income earners, and a substantial increase in the amount of wealth going to high-income earners. So it would require a substantial net payment from people on high incomes to support this policy, and of course that's why it's being pretty vigorously resisted.
Yeah, I think I myself, I have a lot of concerns about our natural environment and the way our society and our current lifestyles are destroying our natural environment. And I guess I do have a concern as well that things that lead to big government expenditure, they are kind of a rationale for more like plundering of the environment to pay for these things. Do you think that's a concern?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't think there's a direct linkage between this kind of policy and those issues, because essentially these are redistributive policies, so we're not actually producing and consuming more stuff. Primarily, we're shifting income from one group in the community to another. I think a part of the program that goes naturally with this, though, will be a shift to reduce working hours, and so that would a shift to more leisure and less market production.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point as well. I guess it's in some ways it seems like a separate issue, but you're saying it's linked, and I think it's something that really is an issue that should be talked about more, is reducing working hours. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. of all people, the Productivity Commission observed recently, we've had huge increases in productivity over the last 40 or 50 years with no significant reduction in standard working hours. The Productivity Commission, of course, represents this as people want more stuff, but in reality, this has been driven primarily by employers. Employer organisations have strongly resisted reductions in standard working hours ever since they managed to defeat the campaign for a 35-hour week back in the 1980s. And, of course, a version of this is work from home, where we've seen again, without much evidence in favour, bosses almost uniformly saying this is terrible and has to end. And when you look at the evidence, it really is because they like being in the office and walking around and seeing people working. There's very little evidence that people are less productive. And in fact, the experience of the pandemic is striking, that with no preparation at all, people switched from full-time work to full-time work from home, and the economy barely noticed.
This is a big topic that I'm really into, about reducing working hours. So do you think that there could be some kind of government payment? Because I guess part of the worry with reducing working hours is if you reduce people's income, people can't afford for things as they currently cost in our current economic situation. So do you think we could reduce working hours and the government sort of pay the extra amount that people would lose from working less? Or how do you think that model might work?
I think in the end, if we work less, we consume less. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, there are plenty of gains we can make from a reduction in working hours. Part of this would be a shift in income from profits to wages. The profit share of income has increased a lot. Part of it would be that with the more better work-life balance we have, the more likely we are to have stable employment and therefore less cost of job switching and so forth. And there's also evidence that with shorter working hours, people produce somewhat more per hour. So that if you reduce your working hours by 20%, you don't reduce your output by 20%. And all this is complicated now, of course, with a lot of the work studying this was done before work from home became a big deal. That complicates things a bit further, and then we need to look at things like the right not to be interrupted, which we do have legislated by the current government. One of the positive things they've done.
Yeah, which was also resisted strongly by the ownership class as well.
Yes.
And I think you're saying we could just redistribute money from profits to income is also one that might meet with some resistance, eh?
Undoubtedly, there's going to be strong resistance, and of course, what we've seen as a general tendency, again for the last 40 or 50 years, is a strong increase in the shift in the balance of power from workers to employers. But we have seen, I think, some reversals in that, really starting with the defeat of work choices back in 2007. Yeah, we've seen a bunch of changes then, and certainly work from home and the right to disconnect have shifted the balance of power in important ways, I think, so that people have been able to reassert a degree of control over their working lives, which was absolutely taken away with something like work choices, and that employers who've tried to resist this have in general failed. So I think, New South Wales Premier, for example, apparently based on the interests of CBD property owners and cafes in Sydney, announced that all his workers would have to go back to full-time office work or close to full-time. As far as I can determine, that's been a dead letter. And we've seen numerous announcements of this kind which have effectively not shifted the dial at all in terms of people returning to the office.
There's a concern, I suppose, that if you give out a lot of money to people they don't currently have, that it has a kind of inflationary impact, and that actually you don't make much gains because once everybody has more demand power, the price of everything goes up. Is that a concern for something like a universal basic income?
Well, it's certainly a concern if you fund it by just giving the money. You have to take that money from other people, and the obvious people are high income earners. And
would that dispel any concerns about inflation on the economy?
Well, certainly it implies that there's, although we need to look a little bit at things like relative tendency to consume, that essentially implies that you add demand from people who don't have it, take it away from people who do. There should be no net effect.
What about something, say, like people in a lower income band are more often renters, whereas people in a higher income band are property owners, and so then you're adding demand to rent but not taking away from another section?
Well, that gets complicated, but in the end, people spend money on housing, and that's true whether they're owners or renters.
There have been some trials of universal basic income, different models. Can you share a bit about how those trials have gone?
Yeah. The first thing to remember is these are very much the kind of model that I've been talking about, which is extending less conditional payments to people who are currently unemployed. So no one has tried on any significant scale the idea of giving everybody in a community enough to live on, even if they already have enough. There's a little bit of money gets given out in Alaska every year, but it's essentially pocket money. And so what we've seen is that the outcomes have been mixed from, I would say, reasonably strongly positive to neutral. That is, some of them have shown significant improvements in people, in well-being, but also in things like engagements. Others have shown people are better off because they have more money, but there hasn't been much of an impact on things like workforce participation. None of them have produced the kind of negative results that people might fear.
So I last interviewed you 5 years ago about this, which was just before COVID, I think. And so a few things have changed, of course. COVID, with work from home and also with increased welfare payments. There's also been the supply crisis, financial crisis, and more recently the rise of generative AI and concerns about what that would have for a workforce. I guess, do you think this conversation has progressed in any way given those developments in the last 5 years?
Well, I think certainly I think the COVID experience had a bunch of effects, but it certainly, I think, changed some attitudes in the sense that lots of people who had never been on welfare were suddenly receiving welfare payments. We saw that we could increase unemployment benefits without drastic adverse effects. Some of that was lost, but we did get a bit of a real increase in unemployment benefits, which for the first time in many decades. And I think in general, the effect of work from home has been to reduce the notion, to reduce the pull of the notion that in some sense work is defining for people. So we've seen much more of a notion of we need to earn a living, but not that turning up at the office 5 days a week to find you as a person.
Yeah. And what about AI? There's been a lot of talk about it recently, even the Productivity Commission, and some people believe that the future of AI sort of necessitates something like a universal basic income. Do you think it changes the conversation?
Well, at this stage, I am pretty much a skeptic. I think it will be an important source of productivity growth, which is good because we've run out of the other sources, but I think it's now been around for quite a while. Doubtless there will be better use of it in the future than there has been so far, but really we simply haven't seen large amounts of big productivity growth. It's true, of course, in the US that companies that hired lots and lots of workers, IT companies, have sacked people and used AI as an excuse, but there really doesn't seem as yet to have been the kind of impact that those predictions would depend on. And of course, most of those predictions start from the assumption that there'll be no change in working hours. If AI doubled our productivity, we could just all work 20 hours a week instead of 40.
Sounds good.
Yep.
I might even get on board with the AI, which I haven't been. But
Yep.
All right. I guess the final question, and it is a big question, is if all these things are good ideas and they sound like they are good, what needs to happen for these things to come into action? What role does the ordinary worker or the ordinary person play?
On the one hand, I think we can all look at our own attitudes and say, get away from this notion that you're defined by paid work. So that's, of course, an individual and social change in attitudes. Of course, what would be nice is to elect a government that would do something about this stuff. I think I think we had some bad luck back in 2019. I think if Labor had won then, we might have seen some significant progress. As it is, unfortunately, at the national level, and most of the states really, we have governments that are determined to do as little as possible. So, and of course, we also face the urgent challenge of the far right, represented by people like Trump, who certainly are not going to help us towards any kind of anything like universal basic income. So I don't have a good political strategy. I'm not a political strategist, but I think we can all certainly think about the fact that people can contribute to society in all sorts of ways beyond turning up at an office or work site 5 days a week.
Do you think that the traditional workplace organising of trade unions, has the ability to do this, or it should be a part of that strategy?
Well, what we've seen, I think, has been a shift in the a positive shift, I think, in the position of unions. So for a long while, unions were very sceptical about UBI, I think, and also had really dropped the ball to a large extent on things like working hours. They'd settled into an enterprise bargaining frame where really they gave up a lot of workplace rights in return for higher wages. I think we've seen, responding to their members, unions now pushing hard for codifying work from home in particular, but also now pushing for reduced working hours. So that's the workplace side of the story. And we've seen, I think, unions take a more positive view on expanding benefits and so forth.
All right. Thanks very much, John.
Great. Okay. Nice talking to you.
We have been talking with John Quiggin about different future possibilities for work, and we have been chatting about universal basic income, reduced working hours, job guarantees, and all these kind of important questions that we should be asking about how should we be spending our working hours, how should we be distributing the resources of our society. And it's about our time, isn't it? It's about our lives, fundamentally. You spend so much of your life at work in one way or another, either at home doing the unpaid work, reproductive labour, as they say, or doing the volunteer work that fulfills our passions and creates the world we want to see, or doing paid work in which we exchange our time and skills for a portion of the value that we generate for our employer. Whichever way it is a lot of our lives, and so it's fundamental questions that we should be asking and talking about. And another economist who I spoke to this about a while ago actually was Stephen Hale. It was part of a broader interview about modern monetary theory, which is a long topic, but this was an interesting bit out of it where I brought up with him about universal basic incomes and that question, and he had a different model, a job guarantee. And so let's hear from Stephen Hale.
We need to wean ourselves off this almost religion that we have, where how we judge our economic success is based on how quickly gross domestic product is increasing. And if we are going to encourage people to consider alternative metrics of economic progress, one of which, if people want to look it up and find out what it includes, is something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, then the first thing that we need to do is to give people a degree of economic security. When people feel themselves at risk of being forced into poverty or involuntary unemployment, being left behind as a consequence of the essential restructuring which we have to do in our economy in the future in order to live within our planetary limits, then they are understandably very reluctant to go along with a change in the philosophy of how we go about managing our economy. So that's where a green job guarantee comes in.
Some people have mentioned universal basic income as a similar idea to your job guarantee.
It depends what you mean by universal basic income. People are often very vague when they use that term about what they mean. So perhaps I should define what I would mean by it. Universal would imply that it went to absolutely every adult without any conditions or means testing. including me and you, but also including Malcolm Turnbull and Gina Reinhardt. Basic would mean it would have to be set at a non-poverty level, and that would have to be at least 25,000 Australian dollars. Now, if you are going to pay $25,000 a year to the 20 million adults in Australia, that comes out as $500 billion. $500 billion is slightly more than the federal government was spending on absolutely everything just before the pandemic. So that would be the biggest spending program in Australian political history, certainly outside wartime. You could get some of it back because the idea is, of course, that you replace welfare payments, but that would only save you about 170 billion. So it would still be a massive increase in deficit spending. Now, what could you do to stop that being inflationary? You're not going to run out of Australian dollars. There's no financial constraint on the government, but there is a real constraint. And as you were saying, there's an ecological constraint too. That would be a massive stimulus to the economy. In order to offset it, you would need to, just really to deal with that one program, you'd need to change the Australian tax system to make it a Scandinavian one, which is fine. I just don't think people will vote for it. So that's one of the reasons why I'm sceptical. Another reason, it's not counter-cyclical. Spending on it does not fall when the economy is growing and when inflation is picking up. It doesn't rise if the economy goes into recession and people start losing their jobs. So it doesn't have the counter-cyclical stabilising role that a job guarantee would have. That having been said, I share the desires of people that are enthusiastic about AUBI to ensure that nobody is forced into poverty. And also, I think it's important that people are not absolutely forced to participate in a job guarantee. It's supposed to be an option, not an obligation. So how can you go about doing that without needing to reform the tax system in such a way that this is just a pipe dream because people wouldn't vote for it, but also without it being significantly inflationary or involving a massive stimulus to the economy that would mean you'd have to turn back on all the coal-fired power stations, for example. You can go about doing that by having a guaranteed minimum income. Some people would still call it a universal basic income. Well, it wouldn't be. It would be means tested. But it would be at a level which kept you out of extreme poverty, somewhere in the low to mid 20,000s. If you had no other source of income, if you had no other assets available, then you would be entitled to that level of income support without conditions attached to it. In other words, I'm offering you a much better deal in a job guarantee, but if you choose not to participate for one reason or another, I'm not going to make a moral judgment about you. I still don't want you living in extreme poverty. However, if you participate in your local job guarantee, and there should be a huge variety of activities that you can participate in, the New Deal in the 1930s in the US, for example, included things as diverse as writing and acting and art for those people that had the necessary skills. So we're not just talking about things like planting trees or working in a community garden and stuff. There should be a huge variety of activities available. If you're in the job guarantee, you're going to be on $40,000 plus. You're going to be on whatever the statutory minimum wage is, at least, and you're going to have decent working conditions. And I think most people would choose that option. I think a relatively small proportion of people would choose to rely on that guaranteed minimum income instead. Another benefit, of course, is if you are in the job guarantee and you don't turn up for work, or you're disruptive at work or violent or anything like that, you can be suspended from the program without you being forced into penury, because there is still that guaranteed basic income to fall back on. Now, you could do that without significant changes in our tax system at all, because a job guarantee under normal circumstances is not going to be huge. It's going to involve spending of 1 or 2%, at most 3% of GDP. There's another 97% of GDP out there. This is not communism or anything. It's providing people with the opportunity to have decent employment, who are usually at the back of the queue for work, who are the first ones to lose their jobs in a downturn, the last ones to get jobs in an upturn. That the rest of us, we might participate in the job guarantee briefly at some point in life, but it's not really for us. So the job guarantee on its own is not going to be inflationary and doesn't require a wholesale rewriting of the tax system. And the way that I've just discussed a guaranteed minimum income, I don't believe that would either. That's why I'm advocating something a little bit different, something that I genuinely think there is at least an outside chance that the government will choose to implement, and that they're certainly in a position to implement if they should choose to do so without going to an election campaign threatening people on middle incomes with a significant increase in tax.
Stephen hails his idea for a job guarantee. And, well, of course, most of us, we are working one way or another, and we mostly have to work to get by to survive. And some of us, we try our best to find our most fulfilling or least painful way to do that. But as we have been talking about on the show today, there's so many different ways of imagining the possibilities of work and the possibilities of getting that subsistence to survive. And it's sort of our duty for ourselves, really. We should be trying to come up with creative ways to do work better, but also for those who will come after us. And this year, as we celebrate 50 years of 4ZZZ, it's a really great time to be thinking about the future as well, and appreciate those people who started up something, out of nothing to make a community radio station or whatever other projects people have started. And you never know, really, what will come of your work. But 50 years later, 4ZZZ is still going strong, and it's a credit to those people who took the leap to make it happen and put in the work. And so, we should be thinking about a better society, what it might look like, and how we can start putting it into place today. And we don't know what will come of all our hard work, but I do know that that's the kind of work I want to be spending my time doing. Hey, we're just about out of time on the paradigm shift, and I'll see you next week.